Robert Lawrence is the Albert Williams Professor of Trade and Investment and the John F. Case Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C., and also he is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He served as a member of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors from March 1999 to January 2001. Dr. Lawrence has written about 100 papers and articles and 30 books and monographs on topics in the field of international economics. He is currently working on a book on the future of manufacturing. Robert, thank you so much for joining us today on this important topic. Over to you.
Sergey, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be talking to all of you today. It's really unfortunate that those who would be participating in our program this year can't attend that program in person. But what we thought would be to give you a flavor of the kind of discussion that we will be having in our next trade policy program. And I'll be talking today about the future of the global trading system. And please, as I talk, feel free to submit your questions. Those of you who've attended in the past will know my colleague, Craig Van Grastek. Basically, our program integrates perspectives on trade from the viewpoint of economics, from the viewpoint of politics, and from the viewpoint of the rules, as well as teaching skills in negotiation. And Craig is a key participant, and so I've asked him to play the role of semi-moderator by picking up your questions and posing them to me at the end. We are starting a little late. We may run a little late, but I hope you will remain with us and find what I have to say interesting. Next slide, please. So I'd like to remind you about where we stood with respect to the trading system as of, say, 2016. It was a mixed picture, but by and large, it was very optimistic. What we'd seen was an immense expansion in global value chains, and we'd also seen an explosion in regional trading agreements. And at the time, there were these negotiations, not only bilaterally, but negotiations for what we called mega regional agreements, the TPP, where the United States was a key participant, but many other Pacific nations, the TTIP between the US and the EU, the RCEP, another big Asian negotiation was taking place. But in addition to those regional agreements, we also saw enthusiasm for trade, where many developing countries were actually unilaterally opening their markets. There was also a growing enthusiasm for being part of the World Trade Organization. And we had Russia and China joining during this period. And although there were problems with the Doha round, the dispute settlement system was working very well. So by and large, those of you who attended the course during this period got a pretty optimistic view about the trends in the global trading system. Although even at that time, we understood that there were problems. One was the major impasse in the Doha round. There were clashes between countries over what was the right way to separate between deeper integration on the one hand and national policy space on the other. And so, for instance, there were efforts to try to bring labor standards and investment into the WTO, but it was impossible to get a consensus. And in fact, a major reason for regionalism was that countries were pursuing these issues with coalitions of the willing. What also emerged in the Doha Round were problems in absorbing the large emerging economies, particularly since they could self-define and were entitled to special and differential treatment. And this gave developed countries a problem in granting all developing countries this special and differential treatment. At the time, we also knew that there were major losses in employment in manufacturing, especially in the United States. Some 6 million jobs were lost between 2000 and 2010. So we have a mixed bag to start as of 2016. Let's move to the next slide. We could already see, if you look at the slide, that going back to the global financial crisis, the trend in world trade had slowed down. You can see that very noticeably. Previously, trade had been growing at about twice the pace of GDP. But after the global financial crisis in 2008, you can see that the growth rate really took a dip. Next slide. Global value chains, which had been flourishing, also declined in growth. We think that a major reason for this was what had happened in China. China had spurred these global value chains by acting as the factory of the world. But as of 2007, 2008, China started to move towards becoming more self-sufficient, adding value domestically. And this was one of the reasons why there was a slowdown in the pace of the global value chains. Next slide, please. But in around 2016, it suddenly became apparent that we were living in a world that was being radically transformed, and a global system that was being radically transformed. And this was being driven by forces both of nationalism, rising nationalism, and populism. And emblematic was the election of Donald Trump in the United States and the vote in the United Kingdom to leave the European Union, the Brexit vote. Trump, here you can see, was able to get to be elected because he had an ear to the ground, and there were a large number of Americans who were adversely affected by the trends that were taking place in the global economy. His narrative was that the major reason for this had been bad trade agreements, which the United States had signed. And in his inaugural address, he proclaimed his intention to follow a nationalistic and protectionist policy, which he said would lead to great prosperity. He said in that inaugural address, we will buy American and we will hire American. And indeed, the Trump administration has followed a policy of trying to raise trade barriers under any pretext that they can find, and in trying to encourage multinational firms, especially American ones, to reshore to the United States. We also saw that one of the pretexts they used was national security. And they brought a case in the US, and eventually it landed up in imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, and resulted in other countries retaliating. And then, of course, there was the mother of all conflicts, which were the trade frictions between China and the United States. Trump himself was preoccupied with the imbalance of trade between the United States and China. But in addition, there were concerns that China had been forcing the transfer of intellectual property from American firms to local firms. And China had embarked on a program, an industrial policy program, Made in China 2025, which Americans viewed as quite threatening. And so what we saw was a deterioration in the relationships between the two countries, superpower rivalry, and essentially a tariff war. By invoking the moribund 301 legislation, America levied tariffs against a lot of Chinese products. They felt it incumbent to retaliate. And we had a period, which still exists today in part, of retaliation and the tariff war. What's interesting is that the studies which have been made about that tariff conflict have shown that by and large, the tariffs have been paid by Americans. What that means basically is that American firms didn't have a lot of flexibility in adjusting their sourcing. And so we're required to buy from China. And technically, what we know is under those circumstances, the tariffs are going to be passed forward. And the study suggested that these raise costs in the United States. As of 2020, we finally, after a tortuous series of negotiations, got what has been claimed is the first installment in an agreement. Nonetheless, this is an interim agreement. What it involves is managed trade, in effect, the United States aiming at inducing the Chinese to import a certain quantity of targeted products. Most analysts who have looked very carefully believe, especially with COVID, this is unachievable. There were some agreements in relationship to intellectual property protection, but basically no real progress on this question of Chinese industrial policies. I think many observers believe it's very unlikely that the Chinese are going to be willing to change what is their core development strategy, especially under the inducement and threats of these tariffs. We've also seen a spreading of the frictions between the United States and China. Huawei, emblematic of the conflicts over national security, and now issues relating to the treatment of Uyghurs and human rights in Hong Kong. So it would seem that there has been a spillover from issues which relate directly to trade to broader questions that relate to national security and to human rights. Meanwhile, the US has not only directed its attention to China. President Trump refused to join the TPP, and within the WTO, the US has systematically undermined the appellate body. Next slide, please. Here I show you the US Trade Representative giving his opinion this year, a few weeks ago, about the appellate body. And in his view, it wasn't working well. And he says it's been working against the United States. This is specifically because of large losses that the US has suffered on questions of trade remedies like anti-dumping and especially its practice of so-called zeroing. And he says, I think it was hurting our workers. It was non-representative, and from my point of view, I don't feel any compulsion to have it ever come back into effect. So here we have what we used to think of as the jewel in the crown of the WTO, now being threatened by, and it looks unlikely unless the US changes its mind, that it can be reconstituted as it previously was. Next slide, please. Let me turn now to think about COVID. And I think the right way to start is to recognize the essence of those global value chains. In effect, one dimension of the global value chains relates to their allowing an intense amount, an extreme amount of specialization, so that products are no longer made in single countries, but are rather made in the world. And that perspective immediately minimizes in terms of inefficiencies, but also, as we have found out, renders them quite vulnerable. There's a second dimension of these global supply chains, which is that they involve relationships between and within firms. So an essential ingredient in the operation of these supply chains is direct face-to-face, people-to-people contact. And in fact, what we saw was when the virus broke out in China, the major transmission to other countries actually occurred through these, their participation in these global value chains. And here I list a few of the ways in which we saw outbreaks very intimately related to those global supply chains, whether it was in Korea or in Germany or in Italy or even in the United States, places that served as major either launching points or receiving points for global supply chains were the ones where we saw the outbreak of the disease occur in a very robust way and quite early on in the process. Next slide. Well, the great strength of the global supply chains is that they allow for specialization. And one of the networks that had been established related to medical supplies and medical equipment. And often these involved a lot of low value added inputs that were provided in China and more sophisticated elements that came from other parts of the world. When China was hit by the COVID crisis, it restricted some of its exports initially, and that created panic and shortages in other parts of the world. China wasn't the only country, though, to restrict exports. If you go to the WTO website, you can see a very extensive list of countries who restricted exports of medical equipment, something which actually they're allowed to do under WTO rules in the event of a domestic emergency. We even saw some of these restrictions being applied, say, by Germany within the European Union. The single market is supposed not to have these barriers. We also saw that some multinational firms who were part of these global supply chains wanted to maintain their business relationships. And so rather than keep all their supplies in one location, 3M Corporation, for instance, in the United States, continue to export some of them out of the US. So in this environment of shortages of key protective equipment and other kinds of inputs required for the treatment of the virus, including masks, there was a lot of friction in the trading system. Actually, eventually, as the disease and contagion seemed to slow down in China, it became a major supplier of this equipment to the rest of the world. And that has been a major vehicle for Chinese diplomacy. And the EU has opened the internal market, and so is functioning much more smoothly today. Next slide, please. To understand the effects of the crisis on world trade, it's useful to distinguish between supply shocks and demand shocks. If you have an extensive interlinked chain of production, as soon as you get a shutdown in one of those links, well, the whole chain finds difficulty in operating. And so as countries began to shut down, others found that shortages emerged. And so we had a transmission of those supply shocks related to shortages of key inputs. And then, of course, those who were at the end of the supply chain, who were the sources of demand for the products, also had locked down their economies. And the consequence was that there were gluts that emerged in cases where the supply chains could still operate. So we have a really devastating shock to global trade, occurring both through shortages of inputs and inadequate demand. We also see that that complementarity which is required between the movement of people and the movement of goods was effectively stymied by the restrictions in the global supply, by the restrictions on travel. And so traditionally, firms and executives go abroad in order to make their purchases, and this has become impossible. There's also the direct effect on tourism and the airlines, who today have recovered from their all-time lows, but are still only operating at 50% of capacity, and the sailors who can't get off the ships. And as a result, ocean travel and transportation has been impaired. So we've really had a very, very severe shock to global trade. Next slide. You can see here some of the projections. The WTO, the red line shows you their worst case scenario, and the green line showed you their more optimistic scenario. Recently, Director General Azevedo announced that it looked as though the world was actually hewing more closely to the optimistic scenario, and that still means that global trade plummeted in the second quarter of this year by 18.5%. The WTO believes that this is going to work out to something close to 13% for the year as a whole. This is all premised on the assumption that we are going to see a continuation of the reopening of a lot of commercial activity, something which the recent outbreaks in the United States have called into question. And if we get a second wave, this could turn out to be, even this pessimistic number could turn out to be too optimistic. So we are very, very unlikely to return to the same levels of international trade activity, certainly by the end of this year, and probably well into next. And that's even under the optimistic assumption that we're able to come up with a vaccine that we can spread. Next. Next slide. One of the impressive dimensions in the government's response has been their efforts to try to stabilize economic activity. Now, this has been true, of course, of governments in the developed economies who have the fiscal resources to do this. In developing countries, the crisis has come at a time for many countries where already there were fiscal constraints, and so they haven't been able to offer us the same kind of support. Nonetheless, the major focus has been on providing short-term aid to both workers and to firms. In some countries, the major mechanism has been to pay firms or to give them loans to keep their workers on the books, even if they are furloughed. In other countries, say like the United States, the workers, although there are some programs in that respect, the workers have actually had to be rendered unemployed and then have been given unusually generous unemployment benefits. But what we have is the economy being flushed with finance in order essentially to keep both workers and firms heads above water. Over the long term, though, what we're going to see is a shift towards greater efforts at investment. And we're seeing extensive new industrial policies being launched in many, many countries. Some of these are focused on have an environmental purpose, but others are trying to enhance domestic production capacity. In a sense, this shock to the system has led to a re-emphasis and an effort to build resilience into the economy by reshoring a lot of production. Of course, again, for developing countries who depend on participation in global supply chains, this is not very good news. Next slide, please. It is taken for granted by many that in order to be more resilient to these responses, what you ought to do is to become more self-sufficient. But in fact, self-sufficiency doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a more resilient economy. Firstly, we noticed in the United States that even though we were producing locally some of this medical equipment, our states, because of very weak federal leadership, were still competing in order to obtain necessary PPE and other kinds of medical supplies. So local production didn't really ensure security of supply, even in the narrow view, if you take a narrow perspective on national health. The problem with localization is that it also localizes the shock as well as the response. You know, if you're a country and you only depend on local food and you have a crop failure, well, you're likely to have shortages. In fact, by participating in global supply chains, you can have diversification of your sources of supply and demand, and therefore actually be more resilient in the face of shocks. I once met a gentleman who operated the largest chain of supermarkets in Singapore. And I asked him, you know, how much agricultural production was there in Singapore? And he told me very, very little. I asked him if he wasn't worried about shortages, and he said, absolutely not, because our logistics are so good. I can buy the food I need from many, many sources. So there's clearly a trade-off, if you're thinking about resilience, between self-sufficiency and self-production on the one hand, and the diversification, both on supply and demand sides, that you get from participating globally. Nonetheless, I think one big lesson from this COVID crisis is the need to incorporate the risks into decision-making. The classic economic proposition is that you don't assume a riskless outcome, but that you have to take account of the possibility, especially of what's known as tail risks. And so I think a takeaway here is that, just to coin a phrase, we're going to be moving from just in time to just in case. In effect, we do have to have reserves, but it doesn't necessarily involve completely shutting down global trade. We do need local stockpiles and inventories, but also it's important to think about mechanisms for global coordination. Next slide. So how is globalization likely to develop? It's easy to paint a very pessimistic picture. Already, as I indicated, we've seen this outburst of nationalism. We've seen national security concerns being raised as reasons to inhibit trade. Some of these are real, and countries do have to be concerned where they are strategically vulnerable. But we've also seen national security become a pretext. It used to be that within the WTO, although there's an exception for national security, countries exerted and maintained a lot of forbearance and didn't use those rules. That taboo was basically broken by the United States in those aluminum and steel cases. And we see those disputes now being emulated. We have one currently between Korea and Japan, and another between Russia and Ukraine. And in fact, in the case, there's a third where the WTO has ruled in a case between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, that some of the Saudi measures were not warranted. And so we're seeing that Article 21 of the WTO, the National Security Exception Rule, actually being adjudicated. This is a controversial action. And the United States believes countries should ought to have complete discretion in this area. But it doesn't look like the WTO legal, the judges in the WTO and panelists actually agree with that statement. There's little question that the trade wars, not only those imposed by the US, but the retaliations, have undermined the confidence of those who operate these global supply chains. And they are planning for the future for much greater diversification of their supplies in some cases, and for reshoring in others. We've also seen an erosion in the rules-based system for international trade. I mean, if you look at the agreement between the United States and China, for instance, where the Chinese have now agreed to buy a certain quantity of exports from the US. That's a fundamental change in the system. for one based on market competition to one based on political pressure. We've also, in response to US actions, other countries have imposed retaliations and haven't gone through all the procedures that the rules-based system requires before they actually do retaliate. And then there's the COVID experience, which, as I've already described, has further exposed the vulnerability of these global supply chains. And then finally, I would mention the fact that we're in recession. And we know that political forces are far more receptive to pleas for protection, even when the disturbances don't come directly as a result of international trade. I'd also say that if we look at the fiscal responses from an economic stabilization standpoint, we can say, we've managed, and certainly countries who had the fiscal space are using it in abundance, and that's a good thing. But what we're also seeing is that the countries are using their fiscal expenditures in order to embark on new, ambitious industrial policies. And the more we see subsidies being provided to private enterprises, the more problems that raises for a global trading system in which we're trying to have a level playing field for international competition. Specifically, we're seeing some of these funds being directed towards encouraging the reshoring of production. In 2011, the Japanese, for instance, had a program where they encouraged some of their firms to go abroad. Now they've launched a program encouraging them to come back. We also see this proliferation of national security used at times because of genuine concerns, but more often than not, simply as a way to protect. Nonetheless, the frictions over Huawei and ZTE between China and the United States reflect deeper rivalries in the area of national security. And numerous countries have now become much less open to foreign investment. And then finally, I would mention the challenge of climate change. One of the great achievements of the Paris Accords was that countries could take individual steps. The problem was, thus far, the commitments they took were not really sufficient to deal with the underlying problem. But with each country taking these measures, it was possible to avoid having barriers imposed at the border. But as we move forward, and as taxes on CO2 emissions become increasingly imposed by countries, both because of concerns of what is known as leakage. If we as a country start to take the measures and others simply produce the products, the world as a whole may still have the same amount of emissions. So we want to make sure that they don't get away with it. And so we're seeing the great imminent threat of border taxes, which are extremely problematic from the standpoint that they're good for they may be good for individual countries, but they're very problematic from the standpoint of opening up the global trading system. I don't want to go, I've given you so many pessimistic conclusions, I do want to point to some possibilities of optimism. The fact is that we're still seeing that in many countries there is considerable enthusiasm for global engagement and integration. The RCEP, a mega regional agreement within Asia, is scheduled to conclude by the end of the year, although India, which was going to be one of the participants, doesn't seem likely to join. We've seen a plan for continental free trade being launched within Africa. It will face many obstacles, but it does indicate a commitment to more open trade within that continent. There was this very interesting development when the United States withdrew from TPP. Nonetheless, the other countries went ahead and did launch the CPTPP, took out some of the parts of the agreement, which had been asks of the United States, but nonetheless, a meaningful and deep agreement has been put into effect now. And we're seeing the potential to expand that agreement, perhaps with Korea and Taiwan joining, the United Kingdom also expressing interest in joining. So that could be a mega regional that actually expands and leads to more integration. There's also the fascinating question of whether China could potentially come knocking at the door and join the CPTPP. So I don't think the kinds of antagonisms that we've seen expressed, certainly by the Trump administration, are indicative of a complete rejection of the benefits of free trade. And we actually had the fascinating experience with the renegotiation of the North America Free Trade Agreement. I think for many, the only thing worse than NAFTA was no NAFTA. And what was remarkable in the new USMCA is that it was achieved with bipartisan support. Traditionally, Democrats had been against this type of agreement, and yet it was possible to get both Republican and Democratic support for the new agreement. I have a slide coming up about Joe Biden's new policies, which have just been announced. There's this question of whether Biden is going to be different. The fact is that the programs he has laid out, in one sense, it looks like he will be different in that he won't try to go it alone to the same degree as Trump has. But I think there is still a lot of antagonism and concern about China, and that will still be sustained. I also think there's a movement within the United States towards more government intervention. There's this concern in the United States about stockpiling, and there are numerous technologies which are said to be key: energy and grid resilience technologies, semiconductors, key electronics and related technologies, telecommunications infrastructure, and key raw materials. There's an intention of the Trump administration to use government procurement through the Defense Department in trying to get greater resilience. There are also initiatives within the US Congress by both Republicans and by both Democrats and Republicans, for instance, to launch a whole new program in semiconductors, as just being one example. So all of this is going to make an open trading system much more difficult to operate. If you could go back to the previous slide, I'll conclude and say we can look now for a troubled period certainly at the WTO, but there remain deep interests in pursuing new initiatives, perhaps not comprehensively at the WTO, agreements to which all agree, but so-called plurilateral agreements still offer opportunities to form coalitions of the willing, and not to do so simply on a regional basis, but rather on a more on a basis in which anyone who wants, any country that wants to join or any member that wants to join can join, but not all are forced to join. And certainly there is an immense potential in e-commerce. The only way in which we've been able to basically survive during this period has been the existence of the internet. And it has demonstrated its great potential. And so I think that's an area of fruitful potential negotiation. So these are just the many reactions that I have and that I've been thinking about in recent times. I'd be really interested in hearing some questions, and Craig has been collecting those. And Craig, please tell me what's on people's minds.
Okay, well, thank you, Robert. Thank you for giving us a tour of the horizon. You certainly generated a fair number of questions, and there's a sense of both the optimism and the pessimism that you had expressed. Let me do a little bit of consolidating of questions received, because several people have interest in the same type of area, but the way that they pose the question may variously reflect a more optimistic or a pessimistic approach to it. So let me start by giving you some questions that have been asked about the future of the WTO itself. Steve Chow had a somewhat pessimistic way of posing the question, wondering whether the WTO will be relevant in the context of a US-China decoupling and the spread of protectionism around the world. There was an anonymous participant who asked the question in the context of whether we'll see a US pullout from the WTO. But if you wanted to take a more optimistic approach, another anonymous participant asked the question of whether, and this is posed specifically in terms that I've been asking in my own head lately, will this be like other wars we have had before? We're always using the metaphor of the COVID-19 pandemic as being in a warlike condition. You know that many of the steps that have been taken towards economic integration and global cooperation in the past have come as a consequence of the world trying to rebuild after a war. Is it possible that we will see, as a consequence of this current crisis, renewed efforts to put us back on track?
Well, those are excellent questions. Yes, the other day, Pascal Lamy, who'd been the Director General of the WTO, said that he believed, of course, it would be desirable if the United States were to continue in the WTO and to play a leadership role. Nonetheless, that the WTO might have to find ways of a workaround if the US wasn't going to be a full participant. And that's what I agreed to. I think the WTO is too valuable, and there remains considerable support for the WTO in many, many parts of the world. So I think it's much more likely that without the United States, a diminished WTO could continue to exist. It plays a very vital role in the trade relations of many, many countries. And if it didn't exist, they would have to replicate it in some way or another. So I don't see it being destroyed. I also think, and there have been some statements very recently coming from the US, this current administration, that they don't want to pull out of the WTO. They also find that it's useful and allows them to pursue their interests, even if they disagree with some of the practices. I would expect that a Biden administration would be much more inclined to be more active in the WTO. That doesn't mean to say that the current problems facing the WTO are going to be readily solved. I think among those are a dispute settlement system that operates and commands consensus, but it's been very interesting that a whole group of countries have actually developed an alternative system using the WTO. So we have a parallel system of arbitration in addition to the appellate body. It's certainly not ideal, but it is an operating function which is demanded by the members and very much needed by the members. I think another area which merits re-examination and reconsideration is the issue of special and differential treatment. You know, the climate change negotiations were stalled for many, many years because the large emitters, developing countries, weren't required to take on obligations. Eventually, they hit on this formula in Paris of common but differentiated responsibilities. So instead of having very stark classification categories of developed and developing, or in the case of the climate change between so-called Annex 1 and other countries, the basic idea was countries came and would be forthcoming with their best possible offers. When I look at the amount of water that remains in the tariffs between what countries have bound their tariff rates at and the actual ones they're applying, I think there's a lot of room for countries to come up with good offers that they could live with. So I do think this is a difficult period for the WTO. Much depends on the election coming up in the United States in November. If we do have a new president, I would tend to be more optimistic about the WTO. I also think if you sit back and you don't take a political view, but you say, what kind of lessons should you have learned from the COVID crisis? I think it is, and this comes to your second question, Craig, or the one about are the end of wars good times, you know, for new initiatives? I think if anything, a reading would say that globalization is a reality. We're all in this together. No country is safe when there is a pandemic that can spread. No country can truly isolate itself. New Zealand, Australia, and some other countries may have done reasonably better by closing their borders, but they cannot be secure as long as the disease is rampant in other parts of the world. And that immediately points to the fact that this is a global public bad. And to deal with it, the right approaches involve global cooperation and coordination. So I do think if you, and likewise, I think when it comes to making global supply chains more resilient, well, one solution is completely to retreat back within borders, but another is to ensure that we have better rules when it comes to export controls, and we create a system in which countries can rely upon their interdependence. So if I take off my political realist's hat and I just adopt that of a naive academic economist, I think there's tremendous scope for new initiatives at the global level to deal with these problems that have clearly been revealed.
Okay. There have also been several questions that are related to issues of security and the health crisis that we face. Let me consolidate several of those together. One of our anonymous participants asked if you could give an example of what you mean by abuse of the national security argument. Can you cite some specific case where you think that the effort by a country to fall back on that argument was illegitimate? Lucia Spini asked whether WTO rules are linked to WHO rules, for example, when it comes to travel restrictions. To what extent, the way I would put it is, if a country is operating within guidelines of WHO, does that give it safe harbor within the WTO? John Pettibone asked the question of what about the legislative initiatives in Congress right now to reform the Section 232 national security law? To what extent might we expect Congress to place more restrictions on the president's ability to invoke national security for protectionist purposes? And then finally, Aram Sattar asked the question of food security. What do we see for global food chains post-COVID?
Okay, I'll ask you to remind me if I don't answer these questions adequately. So if you look at the original cases that the United States launched in steel and aluminum, it was hard to look at those cases and say that there's a genuine national security threat to the United States. Of course, as they are written, the rules allow countries a lot of discretion in determining what is vital to their national security. But nonetheless, I was in the Clinton administration. The steel industry came to us. We looked quite carefully at how much steel was used in US national security for national defense, and we found it was around 4%. The United States was importing something like 25% of its steel. So clearly, there was no real national security threat of imminent danger that the United States faced when it came to steel. I think, and the initiative itself tried to set the target that the US firms that currently existed could earn certain profit rates. So I think all of this represented actually an abuse of the national security provision. When, for instance, Saudi Arabia took actions against Qatar, now it had serious disputes with Qatar, but the measures that it took were really economic sanctions, as opposed to measures that were taken in order to protect Saudi Arabia's national security. So that's those would be examples, I believe, where the national security argument is being used as a pretext. Now, the WTO is sometimes deferential to other international organizations. And when it comes to food safety, for instance, it says that if countries actually follow the guidelines of the international standards for food safety, then those countries cannot be accused of protectionism. So Codex is used, for instance, as a way to provide a safe harbor from being accused of being protectionist. But I think simply countries do have discretion to go further than the international standards if they can base that on science or on risk analysis. So the WTO rules do allow countries to exceed, if you will, the international standards if they have good reasons to do so. And I would believe that the same would be true in the case of the WTO, that even though the WTO might lay out a recommended approach, countries would have the ability to go further if they can justify those measures on similar kinds of grounds. But this is not something that is explicitly covered currently in WTO rules. So, in other words, the relationship to the WTO. And that's something that might be a gap in the rules that could be filled at some time in the future. Craig, any other issues I haven't touched on there?
The reform of Section 232 and the food security question.
Yes, so interestingly, I think only yesterday, we had a ruling in the United States in which the president's complete discretion over 232 was called into question, and in the way it had been administered. Certainly, the US Constitution does give the ultimate say over national security questions to the Congress. But the Congress, in turn, has given the president considerable discretion. And we have had some cases recently where some have questioned, pretty much along the lines that I was mentioning when it came to steel, and the administration won the case. So it looked as though the president did have, in the eyes of the Supreme Court, a lot of discretion in defining what is relevant to national security or not. Food security, likewise, is an important area. I think, as I try to stress, it doesn't always mean self-sufficiency. Countries that are the most secure are those who have the access to a multiplicity of supplies. But nonetheless, countries are perfectly within their own rights to have stockpiles or to have long-term contracts with other countries that can enhance their food security.
Okay, well, Erica tells us that we are coming very close to the end of our time, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't reflect the fact that quite a number of participants have asked one variation or another of the question, what does this all mean for developing countries? And often that's put in the perspective of, we understand that there's a lot of conflict between the United States and China. What does it mean, the impact that it may have on third countries? Some people, again, there's pessimism and optimism. Some wonder if it's the issue of when the elephants fight, the grass that gets trampled. A few others ask the question whether this creates opportunities for third countries.
Those are great observations. I think the picture is a very mixed one for developing countries. Firstly, I believe that by and large, an organization like the WTO is very important for developing countries. Essentially, it uses the ability of the strong to extract concessions from one another in order to open markets for all, the so-called most favored nation treatment principle, and that is very vital to developing countries. And so I think a weakening of the WTO is detrimental to developing countries. Secondly, I think many developing countries have been able to use supply chains as a way to get into international trade, not having all the mechanisms to entirely complete a full product. They can nonetheless participate to the degree that there is now greater uncertainty about those supply chains. That leads to a less favorable environment for developing countries. But the upside, in a sense, of some of the conflicts with China, already the global supply chains were moving out of China because of high labor costs. And now there are a lot of firms and operators of global supply chains who are looking around for other places to locate their production facilities. And we're seeing a large influx of some of these firms into countries in like Vietnam, like Cambodia, like Myanmar. We're also seeing some coming back to Mexico, where geographic proximity gives that country other advantages. So I do believe that there are opportunities here. Even though there's a lot of talk about reshoring, the underlying economics says that there are activities and tasks that are better carried out and more efficiently carried out in developing countries. Now, the responsibility on the developing countries is to create environments which are attractive for those operators. And so only when those are in place, and that involves things like logistics, efficient customs, dealing with corruption, improving institutions, those are all very important in taking advantage of the potential opportunities. But I would say that these have been very difficult times for developing countries. Not only, even if you take away the difficulties of dealing with the pandemic itself, many developing countries are highly dependent on remittances, and these have been curtailed. The people who work in those jobs have often been the most adversely affected and have and therefore remittances have declined. Developing countries are often highly dependent on primary commodities for their exports, and we have depressed global primary commodity markets. And developing countries are very dependent on capital inflows. And certainly in the first few months of the crisis, we saw currencies reflecting capital outflows from many developing countries, as there was a flight for security and for safety. So, and then finally, I would add that unlike the financial crisis, in numerous developing countries, there wasn't a lot of fiscal space available, so that they didn't have the ability to finance the sorts of stabilizing programs that were open to other countries. So I do think these have been very tough times for developing countries. I also think hospital facilities and health facilities are not anywhere near the same shape as they are in richer countries. So for a whole host of reasons, aside from what's happening in the global system, these are very trying times. So for those of you who find yourself in these circumstances, our hearts go out to you. This is not an easy time for the global economy. It's not an easy time, I would say, for any single economy. I think by talking about these issues, we can get greater clarity. And I hope that it'll be possible for me to see many of you next year in person, and for us to continue the relationship with those of you with whom it's been a pleasure to engage in the past. So Craig, let me thank you, and Sergey for your, and Erica for helping organize this event. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future, hopefully in person and hopefully at Harvard. So thank you all for attending.